G'day everyone, welcome to Lubrication Explained. In this video we're going to talk about the current supply crisis with lubricants. We'll talk about why lubricant cost is starting to increase and why base oil cost is starting to increase. In order to do that, we're going to talk a bit about global supply chains, a little bit about lubricant supply chains, and try and forecast when all this craziness might end. So if you've been watching the news at all in the last couple of weeks, you probably will have seen a picture that looks like this. So this is, of course, the Suez Canal, and there was a cargo ship that was obviously managed to get wedged. Believe there was some kind of power outage and it sort of just drifted into the sandbank. If you were like me, you facepalmed at this point and realized that there's probably billions and billions of dollars worth of materials that are now trapped or have to go all the way around Africa. So the thing is, the whole global supply chain has really been in disarray for about the last year. And the reason for this is because of this little bugger. So again, unless you've been living under a rock, you will be aware that this is SARS-CoV-2 or the COVID-19 virus, which has played absolute havoc with global supply chains. The way that it probably first manifested itself is when we started thinking about critical equipment as far as healthcare was concerned. So there was a concern about shortage of respirators, then we got concerned about PPE and mask shortages, and then of course there was toilet paper gate. That really kind of, I think, opened people's eyes to how interconnected all the global supply chains are. And realistically, if you live in a country like the US, Canada, or Australia, truly how much of our manufacturing had been outsourced overseas. So now let's talk a little bit about the lubricant supply chain. So it's kind of broken up into two separate components. You've got the base oil supply and the additive supply. And of course, you add base oils and additives, and that's what gives you finished lubricants. Today, we're going to talk mostly about the base oil supply because it's a much simpler supply chain to explain. Additives are very complex because there's many different chemicals and compounds involved. But let's talk about the base oil supply chain, mainly because it makes up 90 to 99% of the volume of a lubricant anyway. And so it's the main thing that we're concerned with. Now, if you'll remember from our mineral oil refining video, we talked about the fact that mineral oils, which make up the vast majority of base oils around the world, they start their life as a barrel of crude oil. And that crude oil is an input into crude oil refining, right? So it would go through first a desalter, then a furnace, and then it goes into an atmospheric tower where you get different fractions. And it's basically different weights that are separated out, right? So really light stuff goes out the top, and then it steadily gets heavier and heavier. You go through sort of petroleum and then diesel, and then, down the bottom you'll get things like bitumen and asphalts. Now, the fact is, you need about 10 barrels of paraffinic crude to make 1 barrel of lubricant base stock, right? And the reason for that is because, as we're showing here, it gets separated out into a whole bunch of different fractions, and most of it is fuel. Okay, and that's a really important thing to keep in mind when we continue this discussion. The reason is because it means that the supply of base oil and the supply of fuel are extremely interconnected. So around the world, there is kind of a network of oil refineries. Most of them are producing fuel. Many of them produce fuel and base oils. And there are only 6, we believe, that produce just base oils, right? So there's only 6. So the rest of them are all either fuels dedicated or fuels and base oil and lube base oils. So keep that in mind. Now, if we were to look at what did the supply chain look like on a sort of a time scale, well, in early 2000, we were coasting along pretty well. Things were relatively normal, and COVID-19 was it was an outbreak in China, but it was confined to sort of that Shenzhen area, hadn't really broken out. And then, of course, it started to spread further across China. And so what we had was a reduction in both supply and demand. So refineries in China obviously had to shut down, right, as China went into lockdown. But because they went into lockdown, the demand for fuel obviously reduced as well. And at that point, we could have made it out of this in an okay situation. But of course, COVID-19 then spread across the world. And so after a period of time, that's when demand and supply kind of fell off a cliff, right? So all of the US and much of Europe started to get affected, and we were starting to see effects in South America as well. So if you can imagine a lot of refineries, first of all, demand for fuel dropped off a cliff, demand for lubricants also dropped off a cliff, and then in response to that, the refineries then have to forecast out what their business is going to look like. Now, this is what they thought it was going to look like. Remember, we have never developed a vaccine within a 5-year timeline. So everyone thought that this pandemic was going to be very protracted and extended. So the fuels industry as a whole thought, okay, we've had a demand shock. It's likely to last for a very long time. If I were planning any kind of significant maintenance in the next 2 years, I should be bringing that forward to now. So a lot of refineries then started to shut down, and they started to go into maintenance mode. All right. So then, demand and supply was both low, but this is where it gets a little bit tricky, and where we're in the current issues right now. Lubricant demand came roaring back in the last few months. Why is that? Well, there are still some things which are continuing to be produced, right? So, the energy industry, for example, continues to truck along. People are still using power in their homes. A lot of factories have started to open up, and so there's a lot more machinery that's turning, and therefore there's a lot more demand for lubricants. However, the demand for fuel has not matched that, right? So you've got to think the international air travel market, for example, is still effectively closed. There isn't that much domestic aviation going on, and demand for petroleum and diesel has also reduced as well. Now, even worse than that, the amount that we can actually supply into the market has also reduced, because there are still many refineries that have not finished their planned maintenance and are still shut down. So there is this massive disconnect between lubricant demand and lubricant supply. And this is why we are starting to see huge issues. When you have a big difference between, or a big delta between supply and demand, that means two things. Firstly, supply is going to be extremely constrained, right? And secondly, you're going to see much higher prices. So what we've seen over the last 2 months is massive spikes in base oil price, massive spikes in finished lubricant prices as well. So that's just kind of the world that we live in at the moment. Now, how long is it going to last? That's really a good question. What we're starting to discover is that the supply of lubricant is intimately interconnected with the supply of fuels. So realistically, what we need for base oil supply to come back is for fuel demand to come back. What's that dependent on? It's dependent on the world opening up. So if fuel demand is truly going to come back, we need to start seeing the very, very fast rollout of vaccines on a worldwide scale. That's really what it's going to take. So realistically, what we're hearing in the news is that could be, sort of in that, let's say, 12 to 18 month time frame. So if you are in the lubricants business, or if you are in a business that depends on the purchase of lubricants, I hate to tell you this, but it's going to be a rough ride probably for about the next year. So, sorry to end on kind of a bum note, but hopefully that gives you a bit of a window into why the lubricants industry is the way it is right now, why things are so crazy, and ultimately how it might get better. As always, if you have questions or comments, please leave them down below. But otherwise, this has been Lubrication Explained.